Welcome to another Maine SBDC webinar. My name is Kelsey Reardon, and I am with the state team hosted by the University of Southern Maine right in Portland. And today we are very lucky to have Maine SBDC at AVCOG Business Advisor and Center Director, Lori Allen. And we're going to be going over government contracts. So how do small businesses find those contracts? How do they figure out if it's a good one, and then how do they win them? So we'll be covering the basics of getting into government contracting today. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put those in the chat below. Likewise, if you respond to any email you've ever gotten from me, it will end up in the same place. So later today, I'll be sending out a follow-up email that will include a link to the recording as well as the slides. And so if you have any questions that come up later, you can just respond to one of those emails. We are recording today's session, so feel free to sit back and enjoy. You don't have to furiously take notes. If you need to leave early, don't worry about it. You'll be able to rewind that and come back in wherever you left. So all of that information, as well as our contact information, will be in my follow-up email. If you're not familiar with the Maine SBDC, we are the Small Business Development Centers, and we provide no-cost confidential business advising. So we have centers throughout the state and advisors in each center, so we can help with just about any small business questions you could have. And if we can't answer them, we can certainly find someone who can. So we'll all of our contact information, including a link to request advising, will be in my email. So that's the fastest way to get set up in our system. And we'll connect you with the closest center and the closest business advisors, but we are doing a lot of this via Zoom still. So our advisors have a lot of experience. Many of them have owned their own business. So if you have a specific industry or something, a very specific niche, we could certainly connect you with somebody who has that experience. So like I said, if you have any questions along the way, stick those in the chat below. But otherwise, I think we're all set to get started. So I'll pass it over to Lori.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you guys for being with us this afternoon. It's a beautiful fall day. November's finally decided to show up. So as Kelsey said, I'm Lori. I'm based out of AVCOG, the Androscoggin Valley Council of Governments in Auburn, and my geographic territory is Androscoggin, Franklin, and Oxford counties. So we cover pretty much the western part of the state. And Kelsey gave you a little bit of an overview about the SBDC, and so I'm not going to read this slide, but if you have not already, I would encourage you to reach out to meet one-on-one with an advisor. And I've got the link there. It's mainesbdc.org, and you can just click register for advising and you will get into one of our inboxes. Just a little bit about me. I've been working in economic and community development probably longer than I care to think about. And during that time, I've written proposals, I've reviewed proposals, I've written RFPs so people can apply for them. I've reviewed different things. I reviewed some proposals for the state of Rhode Island, for the state of Massachusetts. And so I've got a history in this arena. And it's important to me for a couple of reasons. One is that this can be a lucrative source of income, of revenue for small businesses, and we're going to talk about that. It can also help you diversify your revenue sources. So, and that can always be a good thing too. What you don't want to do though is have a business where you have one contract and that's your sole revenue source, because if you do that and that contract goes away, you're out of business. There's a lot of mystery associated with contracting. And so one of my goals with this is to kind of help demystify the process and just make it more accessible to smaller businesses, particularly here in Maine. These federal dollars are appropriated, and I want to see more federal dollars coming to Maine. I think we all want to see that. And then on the state level, you know, we want to keep state businesses employed with state money as much as we can. And so helping everyone understand this process and what goes into this, hopefully in the long run helps all of you get more funding. And then I have one other reason why this is important to me, and it's this guy. My entire career for the past 20 years, this guy has haunted me, and probably every one of other SBDC advisors in the country. There's this myth out there, and a lot of times people will see these infomercials or similar infomercials that claim that there's free government money just sitting there waiting to be taken. And several times a week, if not once a day, I get calls from people saying, you know, I'm a woman-owned business, I'm a minority-owned business, where's the free money? And unfortunately, it's just not the way it works. Most of the funding that goes from governments to small businesses are in the form of contracts. And so pre-COVID, there were no business grants. COVID obviously threw a wrench into that. There were, for a while, definitely grants available to small businesses or forgivable loans in the case of the PPP program. But by and large, grants go to nonprofit organizations, so churches and educational institutions and charitable organizations. Those folks get grants. Small businesses get contracts. And so if you hear anything I hear to say today, it's this: there's no free money. Just doesn't exist. Contracts, however, do exist. And before we get too deep into this, I want to make sure that we have a shared vocabulary, because as I go through this presentation, I may use some terms interchangeably. And this is probably the most boring slide in the world, but I think it's important that we all start at the same space. So there's a couple of abbreviations you'll hear a lot in this arena. One is an RFP, which generally means a request for a proposal. So, you know, maybe a business is looking for someone to design a new website for them. And they might say, okay, please submit proposals to us. And so they're looking for, a proposal to then that they can evaluate to, who's the best business to design their website. Other times you may see something called RFQ. RFQ can mean request for qualifications, meaning a lot of times you'll see this when they're looking for an architect or an engineer, and they're really looking for people who tell us that you're qualified for this, and then we'll have more of a conversation. Or it may mean request for quote. They're looking for a quote. So I need to buy 100 reams of paper, give me your best quote on that paper, kind of thing. So they tend to be used interchangeably sometimes, and other times they mean, very specific things. Another term you'll hear often is a bid for services, which is just that. They're looking for a bid, and typically with bids, and we'll talk about this a little bit further, but when you're bidding on something, particularly if it's a bid for, say, a municipal contract or service, there's very specific things you have to do, forms you have to fill out, that sort of thing. So another common term is procurement, which is like one of the weirdest words to say, but procurement. And that's just what it means to buy goods and services from outside sources. We'll also talk a little bit about something called supplier diversity. And this happens more in the corporate contracting arena, where companies, Walmart being one, Staples is another one, where they are actively sourcing vendors who can supply them with goods who are women, minority-owned, veteran-owned, and so they're looking for diversity in their supplier vendors. We talked about the differences between grants and contracts, so I'm not going to belabor that point, but it's important to know as we get into this that we are really focused on the contracting aspect of things. So where do you find contracts? What are the sources of these, and where do they come from? Federal government is actually the largest purchaser of goods and services in the world, and the federal government buys everything. And anything you can think of, they probably have a contract for it for somewhere. And this can range from, multi-million dollar, if not billion-dollar, defense contracting, or, contracting for medical services, or to buying flowers and having, catering, local government offices catering for meetings and events. So it really runs the broad swath of everything. Similarly, states have contracting, and for obvious reasons, we're going to focus on Maine today. But some of you may be interested in contracting in other states, and I will say that it's like contracting in 50 different countries. Every state has its own process, its own rules. And so you really kind of have to dig in. If you're looking to contract in other states, you're really going to have to kind of, we can put you in touch with another SBDC in another state kind of thing, or we can help you figure out what the state you're looking at requires, but it can be, there's not a lot of similarities. Every state sort of invented their own rules. At the local level here in Maine, county governments put out RFPs and RFQs, as well as the local municipalities. And so you may find resources there. And then finally, corporate contracting or business to business contracting. And again, that's where, retailers are always looking for goods and services to put in their stores. Small businesses are always looking for other small businesses. Maybe it's accounting services, or maybe it's website design, or maybe you need somebody to come in and do your plowing. You own a strip mall and you need somebody to come plow every storm, and you might contract that out. So there's a lot of different range in what contracting opportunities are out there. So these are really the four main sources of contracting. And so my next step is to really show you, so how do you find out about these and where do you go to learn about them? The first step, particularly for federal contracting, is something called the Procurement Technical Assistance Center. Now, PTAC is what we know it as. We love abbreviations in our line of work. But PTAC is actually a sister organization to the SBDC. They are also funded by the SBA, and their focus is government procurement, government contracting, and primarily federal, but they also do some state and municipal. They have that sourcing sometimes as well. It just kind of depends. But what you can do is, it's very similar to the SBDC. They have a website, and which I'll bring up now. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. Let's see, it's going to do it. Yep. And you can become a client. They have all sorts of resources. One of the best things about PTAC is that they can get you set up into an email system. So anytime that there is a contract, and this is government contracting, that might apply to you on a keyword basis, you'll get an email saying, hey, the state of Maine is looking for this thing. And then you can kind of dive in and see if it's really worth your time and effort to go pursue that or not, but at least you're finding out about them. And that can be a great resource. Get back to here we go. One of the other key things I want you to know about for federal contracting is that you do have to be registered in something called sam.gov. And this is true, like if some of you got an EIDL loan or a PPP loan, I believe you had to register at sam.gov. It used to be you could use something called a DUNS number, and they have now gone to this unique entity ID. And I'll just give you the heads up, this does take a while. It's not immediate. There's a process for getting that unique entity ID. So if you're thinking about doing some government contracting, you might want to start down this path sooner rather than later. This is another great resource that I actually just learned about as I was putting this presentation together, but it's a government website, and you can kind of look and see by agency, by budget function, what different agencies are spending their money on and where they're spending their money. So you can search on Maine, you can search on flowers, you can search on, anything. And this will give you an idea, like if you're in your industry, what the federal government is looking for and what kind of contracting opportunities they've had in the past. So this could be helpful too, as you're just, educating yourself on the process. The state of Maine, very similarly, has a website. Most of this stuff is now online, which makes it easier in some ways, but it also makes it a little bit more challenging because you do have to go search for things. State of Maine proposals are, it's DAFS, the Department of Administration and Financial Services. They have a division of procurement services, and they post, you can just see, you know, by DHHS is looking for somebody to manage some software. DEP is looking for an enterprise licensing system. You can just, DAFS and DHHS tend to be the largest agencies that have the most contracting available, just because they're just so large and they do so many different things. But like, you know, amphibian and reptile inventory for the Maine Army National Guard, you know, there's a lot of random things. And this is one of the things I love about government contracting is that there's so many little niches that you can go find depending upon what your business is. So, but you really have to kind of, you know, dig down, and most of them have keyword searches, but this is going to tell you all the main RFPs that have come up. And then there's all sorts of information on their website about, you know, how to become vendors and that sort of thing. Sometimes you may see something else called right here, pre-qualified vendor lists. A lot of times agencies know that they're going to be putting out a lot of bids or requests for proposals. And so having a list of vendors that are already qualified, that they know that they're licensed, they're bonded, they have the certifications needed, that enables them to send out stuff to people who are already on the list and they know that they can fulfill the contract. So that's another thing for the state of Maine you should know about. I'd also mention corporate contracts, and this is something a lot of times we focus solely on government contracting, but I want to throw this out here. And again, part of it is because of the diversity piece. There are a lot of companies, and some of them are here, Staples, CVS, Walmart, Coca-Cola. They are looking for suppliers, and particularly, as I mentioned, supplier diversity. So women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. And so there's different ways you can find out about corporate contracting. There are some trade publications, company websites. If you go to Staples website, they have a whole thing about how to become a vendor for Staples. There's also some certification organizations. One is called WeBank. They are the national certification for women-owned businesses if you want to do corporate contracting. There's a whole other process for women-owned businesses if you want to be a federal contractor, but for corporations, WeBank certifies. And if you go through that program, they also send you emails and get you informed about corporate contracting opportunities for women-owned businesses. Likewise, the Minority and Disadvantaged Business Enterprises has a similar program where you can become certified as a minority-owned business and learn about contracting from that organization. Locally, the Maine Municipal Association is really good about having municipal postings, and it's actually on their job bank page. But if you go over here to the right, you'll see recent RFPs. Town of Wiscasset's, in this case, they're selling a truck. Town of Belgrade's looking for winter maintenance. The town of Topsom is looking for a community center needs assessment, snow plowing for the town of Waterboro. Like, you'll see a lot of, particularly if you're, you know, in construction kind of stuff, you'll see a lot of different municipal RFPs that are relevant. Franklin County is looking for substance abuse and mental health services. So again, there's a little bit of everything on this page, and the Maine Municipal Association is a great resource for those listings. You'll also find that the counties and the towns' websites will also have listings of RFPs. You know, for example, Oxford County, every once in a while, they'll be looking for someone to, it's called a fixed base operator. It's basically somebody to run the Oxford County Airport, right? They put that out to bid. And there's all sorts of different things that county governments do in the state of Maine. And so that can be a source of contracting too. And then at the municipal level, again, sometimes the town websites may have that. If you go to a town meeting, they may announce it. They may put it in a newspaper, or there may be some, public notices that they run to make sure people have a fair shot at placing those bids. So those are the big picture, where to go to find stuff. I think what I really want to focus on, though, is figuring out if these opportunities that you're seeing and you're finding are actually right for your business. And I think once you find an opportunity that you're interested in, it's important to really ask yourself some questions. One is, how long have you been in business? Federal contracting, they really want to see that you've been in business at least 2 years, if not more. Because they don't want to award some huge contract to a business that, they don't know if it's actually going to be around in another year or two. They want to see some stability within the business. They want to see that you're fiscally able to deliver on the contract. And so the longer you've been in business, the more likely you have a shot at actually winning the contract. Now, that's not to say that exceptions don't exist, but in general, the longer you've been in business, the more likely you are to actually secure a contract. Another thing to look at is, are you meeting the requirements of the contract? So they may require a certain level of insurance. They might require a certain licensure. They might require bonding. There's a million other things that they could require. And so you kind of have to sit back and ask yourself, do I meet this criteria? And if I don't, am I going to have to spend money to be able to have those licensing or whatever the criteria may be? And so is it worth it? Is there a time limitation? Is this something that you can realistically get done before, the deadline to submit the RFP is? So you really want to ask yourself those questions. Another thing that I've seen companies get into trouble with is it a realistic stretch? So if you're running $100,000 a year company and you go bid on $1 million contract, that's a huge stretch. And you really need to ask yourself, not just, well, sure, you want the revenue, that's great, but can you actually deliver? And so there's a lot of questions that go into that. For example, if you're taking on a huge project, you may have to add staff. And right now, adding staff is a problem. There's a labor shortage going on. And so it's not like it used to be where you could just say, oh, if I get the contract, I'll hire 5 new people. You might not have that time or the luxury of time to do that. Similarly, if sometimes the contract will pay at the end, when you deliver the goods and services is when you get paid. And so if it's $1 million contract, how are you going to get everything done before you get paid? And there's different ways of doing that, certainly, but do you have a good credit score that you're able to get a loan from a bank to cover the contract costs or a line of credit? So things you need to think about. You also want to think about what's the competition, like who else is likely to have this contract? If it's an existing contract, who has it now? That can also play into your decision of whether to pursue it or not. Can you or a staff person actually devote the time to putting these contract proposals together? And some of them can be lengthy. Some of them can just be you're signing a form and submitting, an estimate, and it's, it'll take you an hour or two at most. But some of these, particularly for the government contracting piece, they can be very, very lengthy and they can be very time consuming. And so you have to kind of think about, do I have the time? Do I have a staff person who has the time and knowledge to put this proposal together? And one of the things that can come as a surprise to people is that normally you can't bill the time and expenses that you've incurred to put the proposal together against the proposal. So if you spend a couple $1,000s on putting a proposal together and you get the proposal, you can't then back bill it to cover those expenses. That's a cost that you have to eat as a business owner. Can you deliver the contract on time and within the parameters? If it's a year-long contract, can you do that? Do you think you can get things together in time to meet those demands, those deadlines rather? If you are a minority or a women-owned business, are you certified? And if not, can you go through the process to get certified in time to meet the RFP deadline? And then finally, the biggest question of all is will you actually profit from this? Are you going to make money? And I have a slide later on that talks about pitfalls, but I've seen clients in the past where they've underbid contracts, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not on purpose. And they've gotten into the middle of the contracts and realized they're losing their shirts. And that's a problem because then they can't fulfill the contract. And so lots of bad things happen because contracts are legal documents and there can be penalties if you don't meet the milestones and meet the contract requirements. So keep that in mind too. So, and this isn't meant to scare you away from contracting, but it's meant to get you to understand that there's a lot that it's not just finding out about the opportunities, it's also being able to evaluate them and really deciding, is this what's best for me and my business at this time? It's also important to do your homework. Who are the decision makers for the RFP? Is it the town select board? Are they the ones that are making the call? And, local politics, is there any sort of local politics that are coming into play? If you're going for a plowing contract, has Joe down the road had the plowing contract for 20 years? And is it just sort of a given? We all, stuff like that happens particularly at the local level. Is this a new opportunity or is this a long-standing thing that's come out and it's just happened to come up for bid? And then you also want to think about how long the decision process will take. Sometimes it can take a week or two. Sometimes it can take 6 months between the time you actually submit the RFP to they actually announce the award. It just depends on, how complicated it is and what agency or organization is doing the decision making. But this is another piece where you might have to go out and ask some questions and do a little sniffing around to figure out, is this worth my time? Is there a question, Kelsey? Yeah, we'll share the slides.
Yep, I got there.
Okay, so at the end of the day, what you want to do is evaluate the cost of putting the proposal together versus the likelihood of actually getting the contract versus the profit potential. Okay, if all those things are coming together, then it makes sense to go forward and pursue the contract. But if one or two of those are out of whack, it might not be worth you pursuing it. Okay. Any questions on anything before we kind of move on to another section of this? Okay, I'm just going to take a sip of water real quick. Okay, so we've found out about an opportunity and we've evaluated it and we decided, okay, it makes sense, we're going to go for it. Here are some typical steps. Not all of these may apply to your situation, but typically these are what happens. You may have to register as a vendor. And again, we talked about with the federal government, you need to register in the sam.gov system. The state of Maine, you may or may not want to be a pre-qualified vendor. Sometimes RFPs will be accepted on an ongoing basis for certain things, but they usually have a specific deadline. And that deadline is something that is hard and fast. And you'll see proposals are due by 5 p.m. at such and such a date. And if you walk in at 5:01 p.m. or you hit send on an email at 5:01 p.m., you're out because they're going to cut it off. They have to. They'll issue the RFP and it can be, it could be a 1-page or 1 paragraph of what they're looking for. It could be a whole, really technical document that could be 10 or 20 pages long, if not more. There may be a pre-bid conference, there might be a workshop or a public hearing. There may be some educational component to finding out more about this RFP. And if it's something you're really trying to figure out if you should bid on, absolutely go to these. A lot of times they're online now. So it's not like you have to necessarily travel to Augusta or travel to Portland. And if it's a municipal, they may be talking about it at a public hearing or a public, a town meeting kind of thing. Select board meeting is what I'm really trying to say. After that, there's often what's called a question and answer process by which they will collect everybody's questions and post answers to them. Usually there's a document, and usually you can find it online. And so, and that's something, if you're working on a proposal or a bid, you want to check that Q&A frequently, because sometimes I've had this happen to me where I've been working on something, a bid with a company, and the terms have changed because so many people have pointed out an error in the application, or they've pointed out that something just can't be done, or maybe the department has changed its mind and, okay, we need to shift the deadline back. I've seen all of those things happen. So keep an eye on those Q&A documents as they get posted. The applications will be due. And then sometimes after the applications are due, they may choose, some finalists, and it could be 3 finalists, it could be 10 finalists or whatever, but they may do a site visit. They may want to see that you can actually deliver. They may want to interview you. I've seen that happen a lot. They may want you to come do a presentation. So submitting the bid is not always the end of the process. There may be more to do after that is actually submitted. And then finally, the award will be made. And again, the length of time really varies between the agency that's doing the RFP and what's at stake and what's involved. So again, it would be probably at least a couple weeks, if not months. So typical elements in the proposal, often there are required forms, and there can often be like an application packet, and you need to go through and make sure that everything's been signed. Sometimes you may need to have certain documents notarized, and so you want to take that into account. There may be certain budget templates that they want you to figure out and fill out. You may need to have proof that, of your LLC paperwork, or that your EIN number. They may need your bank account number. If you're an engineer, they might want a copy of your license, your insurance or your bonding. They may want to have resumes or bios of the owners of the company, as well as any key personnel that might be working on the bid to deliver those goods or services. They may want to see samples of your prior work. They may want to see your financials, your past tax returns, maybe some P&Ls, or some other way of proof that your business is healthy enough and financially stable enough to take on the contract. And then they may ask you for references or a list of your prior clients. And many times they will call and say, hey, we're evaluating a bid. This person worked with you. Can you tell us, that sort of thing. And that's important because, again, they want to make sure that they're issuing these funds and these contracts to people who are going to deliver what they need. And so there also may be what I'm going to call a technical proposal. It's more of a written narrative. And there may be a list of questions that they want you to write answers to. And so sometimes you're going to do this online, and there's going to be very limited characters. It's going to say, answer this really long question in 100 characters or less. And so it can be time consuming to really get it concise. And so you want to give yourself a lot of time. If you've got to write stuff, give yourself some time, because it can actually be it can be harder to write less than write more, if that makes any sense. And because with the online systems, it just will cut you off. It can cut you off mid-sentence if you've exceeded your characters. If you are submitting things in writing, you want to be clear, follow if there's any directions about font size, margin size, page length. Sometimes there's so much competition, particularly with federal proposals, that if you don't meet those requirements, they just throw them out. They don't look at them. If there aren't directions, you can make some assumptions. Don't use a font that's 12 point or less, because otherwise we're all getting out our reading glasses, and if we can't read it, and there's 20 more proposals to read, and I'm struggling to read yours. 1-inch margins, and then use a standard font. I remember one of the hardest things about reviewing proposals would be people would use like those fancy script fonts or funky, and they're actually really hard to read. And so make things easy for whoever's reviewing your proposal and use a standard font, Times New Roman, Arial. Those are the two most common ones because they're easy to read. Another thing you want to think about is a lot of times when you're writing a proposal, there can be a wall of text and it's just words, 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 words. And it's hard for someone to really read that and you know, really understand what you're talking about. So what you may want to do is use some bullet points. You may want to put some graphics in, particularly if you're trying to sell a product, like they're going to want to see what the product looks like. So maybe put pictures or some graphs or something, not only to educate the reviewer, but to break up the wall of text that you're entering. And then another thing you always want to do is do page numbers on your written proposal, but also include your company name, because what can happen is, say there's 5 people reviewing proposals and everybody's got a hard copy. Well, someone, you know, loses half the proposal and, you know, the staple comes out and the proposal's gone everywhere. They don't know whose is which, what page goes with whose proposal, unless you have your company name on there. So before you're submitting it, make sure you've got in your either header or a footer of your document, you know, my company, page 2 kind of thing. You want to, when you're writing this, be as clear and concise as possible, and you want to avoid using too many acronyms or abbreviations. And also use industry jargon kind of judiciously. Like sometimes you're going to be submitting proposals and you know who's going to be reviewing it and you know that they know what you do. I'll tell you, years ago, I was reviewing some proposals for the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island had a program where small businesses could apply for some training funds for their employees. And I was reviewing applications and someone had wrote in and they were talking about hiring black belts to come train their staff. And I kept reading the proposal. It wasn't a very long proposal, maybe 4 or 5 pages, but I had to read it several times. And I was sitting there scratching my head going, I didn't understand why they were hiring black belts. And finally, I'm like, okay, I knew I was missing something. And so I get on Google and that's when I discovered Six Sigma, which is this whole management process and philosophy. But the way they wrote the proposal, it made it sound like they were going to go hire karate instructors, and it made no sense whatsoever. So that sort of thing, if you're talking about something specific, make sure you at least mention that specific thing in case you get a reviewer who doesn't know what they're talking about or what you're talking about. You want to make sure you answer all the questions. Sometimes these questions in these RFPs can be repetitive. They feel like they're asking the same thing twice, just in slightly different ways. They are, but you still have to answer them. And there may be situations where they'll ask a question that simply isn't applicable to you or your business. Make sure that you write not applicable or put NA, because otherwise, they may think you just skipped that section and they'll throw it out because they'll say, well, they didn't fully complete the application because they left this section blank. So never leave anything blank. If it doesn't apply, just make sure you put that in there, not applicable. You may want to consider creating sections and headers that follow the proposal outline. So the reviewer can sit here and say, okay, A, company description, okay, A, B, you know, budget, and they can very clearly make sure that you've answered all the questions. That can be really helpful for a reviewer too. I would also encourage you to write in the third person and not just say, I'm doing this or I'm doing that, but talk as though you're the company. So XYZ Corporation is the premier structural engineering firm in Maine, specializing in commercial building repair. Or Jane Smith is the owner of the company. She has 20 years of experience and holds a master's degree in civil engineering. Okay, use that more professional wording. And then finally, you really get a proofreader, get somebody to look it over, use your grammar and spell check on if you're using a word processor. Just make it as professional as you possibly can. Then you may have to do something explaining them, talking about your company, okay? And this is really, what's your story? Why are you in business? Who are you? What's your organizational structure? Maybe you have a unique philosophy or something very unique. So maybe you make cleaning products and your niche is that you use very environmentally friendly cleaning products. You really want to point out what makes you different, what makes you unique. You may want to give examples of similar projects that you've completed in the past. Maybe include some quotes for some happy customers. You might want to talk about the key personnel for the project. And then you might also just want to talk about the general financial health of your business. You know, what are your trends have been? Maybe you say something like, we've been in business 5 years now. We've seen our revenues triple over the past 3 years. So you want to accentuate all the positives you can about your business as it applies to this contract. Make sure they understand that you're capable, you're knowledgeable, you've done this in the past, and you're ready to go. They may ask you for what's called a scope of services. So this is really, you know, what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? What are your goals and objectives? What's your timetable? And what about, are there any sort of key milestones or reporting requirements that you're going to have to meet along the way? Again, this is going to be really dependent upon the project, but you know, it might be a situation where you have a year-long period to complete this project and they want quarterly updates and reports, and maybe your payments are dependent upon getting those reports in. Then you want to be looking at your pricing and your budget. Getting contracts, it used to be the lowest bid would win. And what happened was, over the time, it became really obvious that companies were putting in a low bid and then they were getting half or 3/4 through the project and then couldn't complete them. And so you may now see, I see it more often than I used to, certainly, where it will say in the bid documents, lowest bid may not necessarily win. So when you're putting your proposal together, you really want to make sure that you're not underselling the cost of the project, especially now where the cost of materials and the cost of labor are really going up and up. So this is not the time to oversell. You want to include all of your costs, and that can be hard. I mean, and you might want to sit down with your SBDC advisor and kind of map out what are all of our costs going to be. And it can be everything from how do I actually buy the goods, how do I actually pay people, to how do I keep my lights on, because everything is part of this project. If you can, you may want to include some contingency fees or administrative costs. And again, this is really dependent upon the bidding agency, but sometimes you're allowed to recoup administrative costs, or sometimes they'll call them overhead costs, or add in some contingency fees in case you do have cost overruns. And then again, be really mindful of what that payment schedule is and when you're going to get paid for what you do, and be mindful that there may be a gap between the time you have to deliver and the time you actually get paid. And sometimes, I used to have a consulting business years ago, and I remember one of the first shocks I had was sending invoices to be paid in 30 days, and they weren't paid in 30 days. And I was looking at the calendar going, I got to pay my rent. So even when things say might be paid in 30 days, or they may not be. So just keep that in mind as well. What about if you're in a creative field? And I have a lot of clients right now who are artists or designers or web folks, and they actually are responding to a lot of RFPs and a lot of RFQs. It can be a little bit different though, because it's not necessarily a tangible thing. And so you may have to go in and do a presentation. You may have to send like a portfolio or a lookbook of your past work. And when you're putting materials together for these things, you really want to be careful, because anytime you're printing things like in full color and having really nice graphics, it looks great, but it can be really, really expensive. And so you're going to want to take into consideration those prep materials. You don't want to spend thousands of dollars on prep materials for a contract that at best is going to cost, generate $1,000 of revenue. So be careful with that. Selling yourself. I'm a native Mainer. On my dad's side, I think we go back seven generations here. Nobody likes to talk about themselves. Like, we're very reserved. We don't like to brag. When you're applying for contracts, when you're doing this work, you got to be able to tell your story. You got to be able to convince people that you are the best choice for this work. And if you have a hard time tooting your own horn, to use a family saying, find other people who can. So find those quotes from satisfied customers. Give them examples of work you've done to show that you know what you're doing. Think about what your value proposition is. Why are you uniquely qualified for this particular project? Are you going to do it better? Are you going to do it faster? Are you going to do it cheaper? Like, what is it that you are going to do that will convince them that you are the best choice for this bid? And maybe another way to think about that is, how is the client, how is the agency that's hiring you, or organization that's hiring you, or company that's hiring you, how are they going to benefit from your particular services? What is it about you that's different? You may also want to focus on results. Like, these are the results we've achieved. We've been in business 4 years, and this is what we've achieved, and this is what we can do for you. But you really need to get comfortable. If you're going to do contracting, you got to be comfortable in selling yourself and making sure that people understand the good work that you do. Contracting is not one of those things where you can rely on word of mouth. Here in Maine, a lot of our small businesses, we rely on word of mouth. Your aunt goes to a hairdresser, and the next thing you know, she's booked up because your aunt tells everybody about her wonderful hairdresser, right? The contracting world doesn't work that way. And so you really have to think about, how am I going to sell my services? Some pitfalls that I've seen along the way. One is just follow the directions. If they tell you, send us 5 pages and do 5 pages, don't do 10, they're going to throw the other 5 out. You want to include all the required documentation and attachments. If you leave out your proof of insurance, they're gonna disregard your application. You want to answer all the questions, dot all the I's, cross all the T's. Sometimes they may make you submit additional copies of your proposal. Again, a lot of this has gone online now, but some of these, particularly with the smaller municipalities, you may have to walk in with 5 different copies, 1 for each select board member. You want to make sure you have all 5, because the town clerk isn't necessarily going to take pity on you and go make an extra copy. Most importantly, make sure you meet the deadline. And then we talked about this earlier, but if they say it's 5 p.m. on a Thursday, that deadline is 5 p.m. on a Thursday, and you want to make sure whatever you got to get in, you get it in by that deadline. Ultimately, the trick here is don't make it easy for them to say no, right? If you tick all these boxes that they have, they're probably going to be left with 4 or 5 applications that actually are legit, that they think, okay, these folks have done their homework, they've ticked all the boxes, now we can evaluate them on their merits, right? If you get denied a contract, don't make it the denial because you forgot something, or don't make the denial because you didn't answer a question. Make them work to say no to you. Make them really evaluate you on the merits of your business and the work you do, right? And so that's my goal with contracting, because look, you're never going to get every contract that you go for. It is a very competitive process. It is, but you want to increase your opportunity for getting those contracts by not making little silly mistakes that's going to get you thrown out before they can even get to the merits of your work. So just some next steps. I would encourage you again to follow up with an SBDC advisor. If you don't have one, get one. I would also really encourage you, particularly if you're interested in government contracting, federal contracting in particular, to make an appointment with PTAC. They are based at Eastern Maine Development Corporation, but they, just like the SBDC, they have advisors all around the state. And so they're available to answer any questions you have. They can help you get set up in sam.gov, and they can help you get set up for email notifications about contracts, opportunities that may be of help to you. So, Kelsey, I thought I saw a question in the chat. Okay.
Yeah, we have a couple. So first, can you be a federal worker and also be a government contractor? Or do you get disqualified if you...
I don't know that answer. That would be a great question for PTAC.
Okay. There we go. And then what is a good rule of thumb to expect to be paid for services from the government, federal government?
I don't quite understand.
I think like it was based when you were talking about the invoices saying like 30 days, then it might not happen. Is there a rule of thumb of like the general timeline?
I think it really depends by agency. And that would be a good thing to sort of, when you talk with PTAC, to ask them, because they'll have like specific knowledge, because it may be like, and I'm making this up, but maybe the Department of Transportation is known for paying 90 days, right? And maybe Health and Human Services is known for paying 60 days, so
they might have that information.
Yeah.
Okay.
Knowing what I know today, I would, so it really depends on the type of work you're doing, okay? So there's certain things that are more likely to be purchased by a local municipality versus the state. So plowing is a great example. A lot of municipalities are looking to hire out plowing, right? So if I've got a plowing business, I'm going to start at the municipal level. I'm probably also going to look into contracting. I've had several clients who had plowing contracts with commercial, like I said, malls or strip malls or stuff like that. And they've done pretty well getting paid, even in years where there's not been much snow. So I would also look at the corporate route for that. Cleaning services, I might start in the corporate realm first, and then move into, getting contracts at the state level, maybe to clean state office buildings kind of thing. So it really depends on what you're doing. I think anytime you're going for a federal contract, having some other type of contract behind you is going to help your chances. Even if it's a corporate local contract kind of thing, anything's going to help your chances of because it just demonstrates that you can fulfill your end of the bargain.
That makes a lot of sense. So if you started with like a local contract, you could prove that you have done this work before,
right?
That you have a record of.
It's hard to go from zero contracting to suddenly getting really large federal contracts. That's hard. Not to say that it can't happen, but it is hard to do. And I think, if anyone, the federal government's probably the most picky in terms of really wanting to make sure that people are understanding, and able to fulfill the contract terms, and having some documentation or proof that you've been able to do it in the past definitely helps.
That makes a lot of sense in terms of like grant funding. They often want to see that you've gotten a grant before. So this is a similar.
Yeah. It's hard. It's not an easy thing to break into, which is why organizations like the SBDC and PTAC exist, because if it was easy, none of us would have jobs.
Yeah, they would have all of them, and they would need us.
We'd all be sitting up watching those infomercials and having the money magically appear in our bank accounts. So we are able to keep it to an hour, which I'm happy about. And I hope this was helpful, whether you are online right now or maybe you're watching this after the fact. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, my contact information is on the last slide. Kelsey will be sending copies of this out. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Kelsey.
Agreed. And thank you so much, Lori. And thank you everyone who showed up. We're getting some thank yous in the chat as well. I got some private messages. So yes, I'm so glad that this was helpful and that we were able to do this today. Keep an eye out for my follow-up email and definitely set up an advising session with an advisor if you have even an inkling that this is something you want to move forward with. We'd be happy to help. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone.
Have a great afternoon.
See you at the next one.